Good morning. He is risen. Okay, this is weak, okay? Hey, every time, like Josh did that in the beginning of the service, you guys have to respond properly because we're going to do it at the end of the service too, okay? So whenever I say he is risen, you say? He is risen. Okay, let's do it for real right now. He is risen. Amen. Hey, listen, it's a huge joy for us to have you worship with us today. If this is your first time, please feel welcome in this community. Here at Crossbridge Church, we like to say that you can belong even before you believe, because we believe that faith is not necessarily a destination, but faith is a journey that we have all embarked on. And so wherever you may find yourself in the spectrum of faith, I want to tell you that this is a safe and healthy community for you. We are glad that you are here, and we're hopeful that you will stay afterwards and meet some of us and, play with us. We have some activities planned out. You'll hear more about it later, but please stay. Don't leave. We want to get to know you because we want to see you back here next week and the week after and the week after and the week after. I don't know if you've seen this painting here. Let me show you this painting. I don't know if you've seen this painting before, but this painting is named the Salvator Mundi. And the Salvator Mundi is one of Leonardo da Vinci's 50 works of art that has survived time, that exist to this day. One of the 15. Among the 15, you have the Mona Lisa, you have the Last Supper, which is painted in a fresco right outside of Milan. This is the Salvator Mundi. And the Salvator Mundi, something interesting about the Salvator Mundi, it was only discovered in 2007. Up until 2007, no one knew that this work has ever existed. This work, before 2007, was hanging in a living room in a house in Baton Rouge. And when the owner of the estate died, they auctioned the house and they auctioned all of the belongings in the house. This work of art was appraised at the time $750 because it was in bad shape. And you can see the next slide here, that I'm not lying. Here is the real paperwork. It's right there, right? It says that it is in poor condition, and the price, $750. Art collector, lover of art, went to that auction, not necessarily with the intention of purchasing that art. He was trying to buy whatever, and he came across this piece of art. He says, man, this really looks like something that is from the school of Leonardo. He was thinking maybe a student. He was thinking maybe someone that had learned his technique. It was passed down to them. So he purchased it for $1,250. And he hung it in his house. And day after day, he would walk by the painting. And he would say, man, this really does look like an original Leonardo. And, that began to sort of take over his, thinking as he contemplated that painting day after day. But he would always debate within himself, and he would hear voices, that can't be true. That's too good to be true. What, a Leonardo with you? You purchased it for $1,250? And finally, a friend encouraged him to authenticate the painting. And so he takes it up to the Sotheby in New York City. And, obviously there's a level of incredulity as the painting is first presented. But as some specialists and some scholars start to look at it, they say, well, it is too good to be true, but we ought to take a look at it. So they gathered all of the scholars and art specialists and authenticators from all over the world. And for 3 years, from 2007 to 2010, they put this painting under severe scrutiny. I mean, we're talking about infrared stuff, technology, scholars, comparative work, measuring the pH of the painting compared to some of Leonardo's original paintings. And after 3 years, the verdict was out. It is a true Leonardo. And in 2017, this piece was auctioned at the famous Christie's in London, and it sold for $450 million. No one has ever paid this amount of money in any work of art in history. It was purchased by an Arab prince for that amount. And since 2017, no one knows what has happened to this work of art. Some believe that it is hanging on the walls of the prince's $500 million yacht to this day. And critics have come out since then. You have articles in the Wall Street Journal and the Atlantic that have come out now questioning the authenticity of the painting. The question still lingers because the verdict is still out. Could it be an original? And people are saying, could this be too good to be true? This is what a disciple of Jesus at one point in time, shortly after the resurrection, thought as well, as he received the news from the other 10 disciples that Jesus had been risen from the dead. He thought to himself, could this be true? And maybe you are here today and you're coming to church on an Easter Sunday because somebody dragged you here, maybe because there's a petting zoo for your kids afterwards. But you're not necessarily sure that 2,000 years ago, Jesus in fact rose from the dead. For you, the jury is still out. Could this be too good to be true? As it was for this disciple, so it is for you. I want us to read about this experience that led this disciple of Jesus to also think this way. Could this be too good to be true if he is risen from the dead? We find ourselves in John chapter 20, and we're going to read verses 24 through 29. Very short passage, so bear with me. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see his hands, the marks of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." 8 days later, his disciples, meaning Jesus' disciples, were inside again, and Thomas was with them. And although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." And Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." If that's you today, if you have heard this story year after year, and you have come to the point of saying, "I'm not sure, because if this is true, maybe it's too good to be the case." And if that's you, I want to encourage you today with 3 things that I see here in this passage. In this encounter that Jesus has with this disciple that doubted that he, Jesus, had really raised from the dead. I want you to look at the fact that Jesus, he welcomes our doubts. Secondly, I want you to look with me at the fact that Jesus offers evidence for our doubts, for everyone that doubts here today. But then lastly, that Jesus, in this experience and through the resurrection, to all of us here, he offers hope. My hope is that you will leave here with a heart filled with hope. First, Jesus welcomes our doubts. And here's the idea that I want you to understand, that if a man like Thomas doubted, it's okay for you to doubt as well. I was thinking about this because when Thomas first hears from the other disciples who were in a room when Jesus showed up, and he was not there, and told them about that experience, what is his natural response? I have to see, I have to touch in order to believe. But this is not coming from the mouth of a person that had never had contact or an experience with Jesus. This is coming from the mouth of somebody that had spent 3 years of his life with Jesus. And if you read about what that life looked like, what happened during those 3 years, as you read the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you would read that all of those that were close to Jesus during those 3 years, they saw amazing things. I mean, they saw Jesus. Thomas saw Jesus casting out demons. Thomas saw Jesus healing the sick, the lame, and the blind, and the lepers. He saw Jesus talk to storms and calm down storms. He saw Jesus feed thousands of people with just a few loaves of bread. He had heard Jesus over and over again say that this one day would happen, that he would die, and that on the third day he would rise for their sakes. And still, when that happened, he still doubted. He still lacked belief. He still asked for evidence. I don't know if you're here today, what are the reasons for your doubts? It may be that that's your personality, or just an inquisitive person. It may be that you have a worldview that it would be too hard to reshuffle things around, and you just don't want to go through the work. Maybe you are here because you are a true skeptic as well. Maybe because you have been disappointed by other Christians, or you don't like some of the things that Christianity has gotten involved with in history and even to this day. I don't know what the reasons are, but the same reasons that you have for doubting, I just want you to understand, were the same reasons that someone like Thomas had for doubting. People were not dumber back then as we think. We say, oh, these superstitious people back in those days, they believed anything. Listen, the IQ levels haven't gone up that much through time. And the same things that they struggled, we struggle too. And if someone that saw Jesus and experienced Jesus this way is doubting, so it is normal for any of us to doubt as well. And we see that by the reaction or the response that Jesus has to Thomas. Now think about this. Jesus had shown up to the 10 disciples. Thomas wasn't in the room. At one point, they saw him. He walked through the walls with his resurrected body. They told Thomas. Thomas obviously questioned and doubted. Then 8 days later, this is where our text picks up, right? 8 days later, Jesus shows up again in the same room. Now this time, Thomas is there. Jesus also walks through the walls. And Jesus, as he walks into the room, it's interesting as we read here in the text, he begins to address Thomas right away. Now, Thomas was not in the first room, and Thomas didn't know that Jesus was seeing and listening to his conversations with the disciples after the disciples' encounter with Jesus, as they witnessed to Thomas. But Jesus was, because Jesus hears and he sees everything. We know that Jesus is God. And, the resurrection of Christ gives even more evidence that Jesus is God. So Jesus already knew what was in Thomas's heart. Jesus had already known. He was already aware of the conversation that Thomas has had with the other disciples. He knew his questions. He knew what he was requesting. And when Jesus walks into the room, the first thing that he says to Thomas and to all of them is what? Peace be with you. And what Jesus is doing here is extraordinary, because you would think that Jesus would barge into that room and say, "How dare you doubt? After 3 years, after seeing me, after hearing all the things that I had to say, you doubted." Now think about this. Thomas is no worse than the other disciples, because they doubted too when the women came to them and announced to them that Jesus had been risen from the dead. They all doubted. And so Jesus walks in there and says, "Peace be with you." He doesn't confront them. He doesn't scold them. He doesn't reprimand them. He says, "Peace be with you." Jesus is saying it's okay for you to doubt. It's normal. It's natural. Don't let this trouble you. Don't feel guilty for it. And then Jesus does something extraordinary. He sits next to Thomas, and he invites Thomas to touch his scars, his scarred hands, feet, his side, which to me is very profound, because not only is Jesus not reprimanding him, but Jesus is inviting him to examine the evidence, to come close and to come near. Why? Because Jesus knows that a doubt is not necessarily a bad thing. Doubt is actually not a bad thing. If you go out and buy a used car, would it be wise for you to buy a car without looking under the hood? No one does this. Would it be wise to take a job without going through the job description and asking questions about the job description? Would it be wise to marry somebody that you never asked any questions about their past, their family, their loves, their desires, what they think about the future? Would it be wise? It's important to question, because doubt is on the other side of the coin of faith. And what we read here in the Bible is that the strongest doubters were precisely the ones who have made the most profound confessions of faith. After Jesus invites him to examine without any judgment the evidence, what are the words that come out of Thomas's mouth? He says, "My Lord and my God." And if you study the Bible, and if you read any commentators of the Bible, they'll tell you that this is by far the strongest confession of faith. Jewish people were the last people to say this about another human being, unless, of course, they really came to the point of believing that he was, in fact, God. Jesus is comfortable with our doubts. Jesus invites our doubts, because strong faith needs those who have looked under the hood of the faith and have asked the fundamental questions about the faith. Now, some of you are here today, and if I were to ask you, "Are you a Christian?" You said, "Oh, of course I'm a Christian." And then if I would take that further and ask the question, "Why do you say that you're a Christian?" "Oh, because I was Christian when I was a baby and at the church." Or you would say, "No, because I was raised in a family and my parents were both Christians and I always saw myself as a Christian." Listen, you need a faith of your own. You need a faith that has to be tested. Otherwise, when the storms of life come, it will not hold water. And how many people have I seen through the years that they call themselves Christians, and when the first difficulty comes and arises, they're out. When they experience the first mockery from some of their peers or friends, they're out. Why? Because they have never looked under the hood of faith. And so if that is you here today, I want to encourage you. You must have your own testimony. You cannot stand on someone else's testimony. I hope you already know that Jesus is okay with your doubts, but if that's you, I want to encourage you in doing 4 things here. The first thing that I want to encourage you is to start with an open mind. A lot of people accuse Christians of being closed-minded, and they're closed-minded too about the faith. They've never opened their minds to try to investigate and look at the evidence. Maybe you'll find that the Salvator Mundi is way more valuable than you ever thought it was. Only if you had kept an open mind. So start with an open mind. then start here. Start with the resurrection of Jesus. A lot of people try to diminish Christianity. A lot of people want to stay away from Christianity because of what some Christians say about science, or some Christians say about politics, or they are utterly disappointed and disgusted with the testimony or the lives of some Christians, and they say, I don't want anything to do with this because I can't believe that people believe that the Christian faith stands in opposition to science. Or somebody that will call themselves a Christian can do these things or say these things or live this way. I don't agree with this ethics of Christianity when it comes to sexuality. Don't start on the fringes. Start at the core. You know why? Because Paul says this. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul was one of the disciples of Jesus. Later on, he writes about the resurrection. You can read that chapter later in 1 Corinthians 15. He says this, if Jesus did not raise from the dead, then our faith is futile. Who cares about the ethics of Christianity? Who cares about, certain opinions about science or whatever that come from Christians? If the resurrection is not true, it doesn't matter. But if it is true, everything changes. So start looking here. Then, thirdly, get under the hood of your own doubts. See, we like only to investigate the claims of the Christian faith, but we are very uncomfortable in investigating our own prejudice sometimes towards the faith. So if you're going to look in one hood, look at the other hood as well. And ask the question, is my doubt objective? Is it influenced by harm that I experience in life? Is there shame attached to my doubt? Because they told me when I was growing up, if you believe this stuff, you're stupid, right? Is it attached to shame? Is it attached to anger? Are you angry at Christians? Is that attached to that? And you don't, therefore, want to look into the claims of Christianity. Is it biased? So look under the hood of your own doubts. And then lastly, don't get comfortable. In other words, don't be lazy, okay? Don't settle for unbelief. Listen to Jesus' words to Thomas. He says, do not disbelieve, believe. There's a difference between doubting and unbelief. Thomas may be a doubter, but he is not an unbeliever. And so many people that I've come across, they call themselves doubters, they call themselves skeptics, maybe agnostics, but they are comfortable in that place and they stopped exploring. Continue to explore. Continue to look into the claims. Don't settle for unbelief. And if you are someone like that, I want to tell you that here at Crossbridge, we are comfortable with you. We are comfortable with your posture of saying, hey, I'm not sure I'm there yet, but I'm going to keep exploring. And we want to posture ourselves as people that come alongside you and say, as you go through that work, as you go through that investigative work, we want to be by your side. So that is Jesus' posture towards our doubts. He welcomes our doubts. But Jesus doesn't just leave Thomas there. He just doesn't leave us there. Jesus also offers evidence for our doubts. He offers evidence for our heads, and he offers evidence for our heart. You know, the fact that Jesus showed up again and put in front of Thomas and the other disciples his resurrected body. And I don't know if you knew this, but after Jesus bodily rose from the dead, he still spent some 40 days eating and drinking and having conversations with his disciples before he ascended into heaven. And more people, each time that he shows up, each time that he appears, begin to experience the resurrected Christ. They see him walking through walls, but they see him eating bread and fish, and they have conversations with him, and they ask questions, and he answers. He encourages and equips his disciples before he ascends into heaven. And the number of eyewitnesses are growing, up to the point that Paul says also in 1 Corinthians 15 that there were about 500 people that were still alive 20 years later after the resurrection that had seen and been with the resurrected Christ. Now, you cannot discount eyewitnesses. This is what lawyers call direct evidence. This is direct evidence. So I want you to just imagine this. So about 23 years ago, September 11 happened. Now imagine this. Imagine if we didn't have any footage of those planes driving into the Twin Towers. And somebody came to you and said, hey, 23 years ago, these two terrorists drove these planes through the Twin Towers. And that's why those towers are no longer there. If there was no footage, let's imagine that there was no photographic technology, that there were no pictures taken, because this is the reality 2,000 years ago. Would you discount and say, that's an utter lie? Or would you say, did people see that? Who saw that? There were thousands of people, and maybe some of you were there, and you saw what happened, and you saw the towers come down. You were living in New York City. Now, if one person said it, just one person, or maybe 5 or 10 or 12 in the case of the disciples, right? If you would still, but if over 500, if thousands of people said, no, we were there, we saw it, you could not discount their eyewitness testimony. And this is what we have here with the resurrection. Do not discount the eyewitness testimony just because it was 2,000 years ago. This is evidence for our head. But there's also evidence for the heart that's given here to Thomas. And I imagine that when Thomas said what he said to the disciples, saying, hey, I need to see, I need to touch his hands, I need to touch his feet, I need to touch his side, what he was asking was for head evidence, for rational facts in order to make up his mind. But then Jesus moves on to give evidence to Thomas that was not for his head, but it was directed at his heart. Jesus says, I want you to see my scars, and I want you to touch my scars. And I believe that that's where the truth of the resurrection finally broke through to Thomas. Because the scars bore witness of Jesus' love for him. He was able to see that everything that he said that he would do, he did. He was faithful and loyal. And even though they had abandoned him in his darkest hour, the scars are there to show that he never abandoned Thomas. He never abandoned the other 10 and the other disciples that surrounded Jesus. The scars are there to show that Jesus has not forsaken you and I, that Jesus has not abandoned you and I. Have you had someone in life to come and ever take a bullet for you? If you know people like that, if you were on the line of fire and someone put their body in front of you. The other day I was talking to this lady that, I met at one of the Crossbridge campuses after a service. And I asked her, why are you here? And she said, because I had this job and I made a huge mistake and I should have been fired and my boss took a hit for me. And I was so puzzled. And so I asked him the next day, he says, you didn't have to do that, thank you. Why did you do that? He says, because I have a Savior that took a hit for me and I can take a hit for people like you. And her next question was, what church do you go to? If you have had someone take a beating, a bullet, suffer for you, you cannot question their love for you. And that's what Thomas saw. And that's what Thomas experienced at that very moment. The resurrection bears evidence not only that Jesus is alive, but that Jesus truly loves us. And we can't fight against that. See, the resurrection gives us full evidence that what happened on that cross on Friday night really worked. See, if Jesus hadn't raised from the dead, how would we know that our sins were really forgiven? You wouldn't. Because the way you know that someone that was sentenced for a crime has fulfilled the demands of the justice system is the day that they pay, the last day that they pay for their crimes in jail, and they walk out because they fulfilled the demands of the law. They know that there's nothing left because they paid for their crimes. When Jesus walked out of that grave, he was given full evidence that you and I were, in fact, forgiven. The other day I was at Costco and, I was in a hurry and I was leaving and there's this man at the door. He's saying, "Hey, sir, you cannot leave. I want to see your receipt." I was like, "Oh man, where's my receipt?" And I showed the receipt and I said, "Bother me no more." The resurrection is the bother me no more that you get to say to the devil. It's the bother me no more that you get to say to the voices of accusations that come against you. It's the bother me no more that you get to say to your negativity and your lack of hope. That's what you get to say. And it's all because of love. And so Jesus not only welcomes our doubts, not only does Jesus offer us evidence for our doubts, but lastly, Jesus offers us hope. In his scarred hands, we bear evidence of what Jesus, in fact, is doing to this broken and wounded world. A lot of people have come to me, and maybe you've asked this question before: if God is so good, why doesn't he put an end to suffering? Have you heard that before? If God exists, why doesn't he do anything about what's happening in our world today? And I'll just say, hang on. It's not over yet. If you wait long enough, you'll see. He'll put all wrongs to right. It started here on Resurrection Day, but it will be completed upon his second coming. And the resurrection shows us that there's both memory of a broken past, but also the fact that healing has taken place. One day, all of creation will be healed of all its malices. And therefore, the resurrection is not the consolation prize that we receive for the life that we have lost, but it's the restoration of everything that we lost in this life. We think that the fact that Jesus rose from the dead is just to say to us, "Hey, I know life is hard, just bear with it. Maybe you can experience your own resurrection as well." I hate consolation prizes. Like when I go to a restaurant and they bring, their bad service, bad food, and then I complain, and then the manager comes and says, "Hey, listen, I'm sorry for the service, I'm sorry for the food. I'm going to bring you a little dessert at the end." I don't care about the dessert, man. That does nothing for me. I already lost my night with my wife. It's gone. So the resurrection is not the consolation, it's the restoration. You know what the resurrection promises? When you look at Jesus' scarred hands, you know what it says? That everything that we lost in this life, one day we will get it back, never to lose it again. The people that you lost, you'll get them back, never to lose them again. The shame that you have tried to be recovering from, you will be made whole, never to lose it again. The justice that you seek, one day you will have, never to lose it again or never to suffer injustice again. The resurrection is the restoration of everything that we lost in this life. And therefore, my last question to all of you today is, think about this, how can you cope with life without this kind of hope? How can you? This is the only solid way to cope with the brokenness of life. In fact, the Apostle Paul writes to a church in a town in Greece, and he says this, that we do not mourn like those who do not have hope. Why? Why is our mourning different? Why is our suffering different? Because we suffer and we mourn with hope. We know it's coming in the future. We know the end already. We know how the movie ends. There's no need for anxiety right now in the present. We know the ending. And maybe you're here today and you're saying, well, I still need a little bit more to come to a place of belief. But maybe you're here today and you're saying, this is enough. Could this be too good to be true? Yes, it is true. And you're saying, I am ready to take that step. And if that's you, my follow-up question to you is, are you willing today, after all that you have heard today, maybe you're not ready, but are you ready today to put your life in his scarred hands, which bear the evidence that not only is he alive, but that he is loving towards you. He is here to encounter you. He is here to meet with you. He is alive and he is loving. Are you ready to put your life into his hands?